All right, welcome to the overview of courts and corrections. Point, as the slide says, and as I just mentioned, is to give you sort of an overview of what the court system looks like and what the correction system looks like, and a bit about how that plays out the media. So in the Moodle, instead of sort of doing general stuff, um, try to be a little more fun looking at forensics for the court stuff and for corrections for scared straight. But I think it's also important to kind of look at how the media plays out in both of those systems more broadly. So that's the point of this. And so the quiz is going to largely riff off of this PowerPoint show and these slides and the content of the Surrett book as well. So for the courts, we'll talk a little bit about what the courts are about and the major players in the courts, and then some other stuff that I think is important. So the basic purpose of the court is to decide guilt or innocence, and kind of secondarily to make sure actors in the criminal justice system play by the rules. So we talked about, for policing, we talked about all the procedural rules, and the courts have to dictate, whether the police follow those procedural laws, and whether the stuff that the police gain can be used in courts. So the three main players in the judicial system are prosecutors and their minions, and defense attorneys and judges. Most of you, probably know the gig, probably know what these folks do, but for anyone who doesn't, the prosecutor is the state's representative in all matters in the criminal justice system. So in Minnesota, we have a district attorney that represents all victims of crime and prosecutes the cases. So prosecutors are important. They decide what charge to hand out. So the police can arrest people on suspicion of burglary, but the prosecutor actually has to charge them with burglary, burglary 2, or whatever the particular offense is. Prosecutors can change the charges. They can enter into plea bargains with defense attorneys. So at every stage, they represent the state. Defense attorneys are the representative of the suspect, and in theory, what they're supposed to do is provide a vigorous defense of their client. If they go to trial, they represent the client at every phase of the trial. They negotiate with prosecutors for plea bargains. At the high end, they hire their own detectives and question their own witnesses and review all the evidence that the prosecutor gives them, and so on and so forth. So in theory, the system is supposed to be sort of a battle, adversarial system where the prosecutor battles the defense attorneys, and the idea is if they both vigorously do their job, then we'll get to the truth. In that scenario, judges are sort of the referee. So judges make sure that they play by the rules. They rule on matters of procedural law, on admission of evidence, and all those sorts of things. They hear appeals. And in some cases, judges, if there's a bench trial, judges can actually also decide guilt or innocence. And then finally, judges are responsible for handing out the sentence. I don't know how much we need to go into this. This kind of lays out what happens in the system. This is a stage up here where there has to be a bill of information or bill of indictment that the prosecutor lays out all the charges. This is the one that most media reports pick up on. So the charging document will contain the police report and all the gory details of a crime. And so when the newspaper has a thing about all the information and how it played out and eyewitness testimony, all that usually comes from that charging document. Next, the judge has to make a decision about what to do prior to the trial. So is this person going to be held in jail? Are they going to get some kind of pretrial release? Then through either a plea bargain or a trial, there's some determination of guilt or innocence, and finally there's a sentence imposed, and if there's any appeals, that happens next. In terms of big issues, one of the big issues is that in theory, our system is adversarial. You have prosecutors battling defense attorneys. In reality, it tends to be more administrative. And so Sam Walker, one of the more famous pointy heads that study courts, devised this analogy called the wedding cake model of courts. At the top, you imagine a wedding cake that goes in layers, and the top layer has little plastic thing of the bride and groom, then it gets bigger and bigger as it goes down. The analogy is that court cases, that top layer is what Walker calls the celebrated cases. So the O.J. case, the Jodi Arias case, that they attract all kinds of media attention. They tend to be trials and not plea bargains, and they tend to have well-paid defense attorneys battling prosecutors with, some kind of salacious detail that makes it newsworthy. And in that sense, those are the sorts of cases that actually approach that ideal of adversarial, that the defense attorney hires their own investigators to do their own research. They can test every little piece of evidence that the prosecutor enters, and it really is a battle. And if you've seen any of the OJ clips or watched any of there's a couple of documentaries on the OJ case. They have this dream team of attorneys that did just that. But that's the sort of rare event. As with all things media, what tends to be covered is sort of the opposite of what happens most often. And so the lower layers of this wedding cake are sort of administrative. So 90 to 95%, depending on the jurisdiction in the sort of case you're talking about, 90 to 95% of cases end up as a result of plea bargain. So in that sense, a trial, any trial, is a rare event. A trial where you have, hired guns for defense attorneys is even more rare. Even most trials, somebody's represented by the public defender and not privately paid attorneys. So at that lower administrative level, you have this idea that there's a bargain, and bargain can, in a sense, be misleading. We tend to think of bargain as like the offender got a deal, they got let off. In reality, the analogy I always use in class is like if you go to buy a new car, right? You go to a car lot and there's a sticker price on the window, and hopefully you don't pay the sticker price, right? Most people recognize that the sticker price is inflated, that you dicker down and you get the real price. So in that sense, typically what happens is that the bargain offered to a suspect is what the going rate is for that case. And so this idea of a courtroom work group is that judges, prosecutors, defense attorneys all work together. They all have a sense of what's normal in their department. And so in order to kind of keep things moving smoothly, they develop sort of informal processes and a shared understanding of what a case is worth. So if you say, all right, here's the facts of the case. It was a burglary committed by a stranger. They took this amount of property. It was the third offense. Everybody that looks at that case is, by and large, going to say, well, it's a probation case, or that's a 6 months in jail case, or whatever it is. And so the plea bargain is like, all right, you plead guilty, and this is what you're going to get. You're going to get that 6 months in jail. So the relationship between the victim and defendant is important because we tend to treat stranger crime a bit more seriously than crime where people know each other. The example I always use in Intro to Crim is not all robberies are the same, right? Like if you get in a dispute with your ex-roommate and you go like, that's my freaking TV, and you go to take it, and he's home, and you forcefully take that TV, and there's a dispute over who owns it, well, technically you committed robbery. But when they look at that case, they're not going to treat it the same way as somebody who just walks up to a stranger and points a pistola in their face and says, give me your wallet. So that's what's meant by this last part here. So the idea is that court system tends to be a bit less dramatic than it's made out to be by the media. Most cases are resolved administratively through plea bargaining. The rare cases that go to trial aren't usually like, all sorts of fireworks and mysterious witnesses and that. They're pretty straightforward cases. So how's the courtroom constructed in the media? Indirectly. So a lot of times when you see the courts, it's like not the main part of the film. Like you see the courts, and a good example of that is Dirty Harry, right? Where you see a prosecutor and I think he's an ex-judge going over the stuff, the police report to figure out whether they can file and deciding that they can't, and so oftentimes it's just sort of indirectly. and use it as an example of sort of liberal judges, or sometimes, racist, harsh judges. It depends on the flavor you're watching. More directly, when it's shown in terms of courtrooms, dramas, infotainment, media trials, there's all kinds of examples now where we directly focus on it. And I'll talk about that in a bit, but as with other crime-related media, and I've already alluded to this, it's the idea that what draws media coverage and attention is the sort of atypical crime victim and criminal. And so one of the problems, one of the issues is that top layer of the wedding cake is portrayed as this is our typical criminal justice system. In reality, it's sort of anything but. It's the sort of rare phenomenon where there actually is a trial. Srep talks a lot about the history of courts, that the first sort of entertainment dramas were based on real events. So Judgment at Nuremberg about the Nazi trials. What's the one I'm thinking of? Kill a Mockingbird wasn't on real events, but it was that idea of Perry Mason, extensive in-court arguments and legal maneuvering. That eventually sort of gives way to a sort of more nuanced backstage approach to looking at legal maneuvers. So the prime example of that is Law and Order. And as Shrep points out, he sort of needed something new, something to impress a generation that was raised on TV and that doesn't sort of buy that courtroom drama anymore. And so the idea that you can see the backstage, the Law and Order, the plea bargains, the deals, the evidence issues, and all that stuff. And you also have these legal thrillers where, I don't know, like movies made up the John Grisham books and those sorts of things, where you have lawyers that sort of go out and try to solve their case and see if their client really is guilty and get wrapped up in the crime and those sorts of things. And I guess the third stage was the birth of infotainment. So when I was a kid, it was Judge Wapner. Now we've, Judge Wapner, Judge Judy, Judge Brown. I don't know. There's a ton of them now. I can't keep track. But the idea that people drop their court cases and agree to have their cases settled instead by infotainment, usually an ex-judge of some sort. And the last phenomenon was the sort of birth of court TV, which is now, I think, still true TV. But court TV was sort of an experiment in broadcasting trials. It was like the C-SPAN, only instead of Congress, you're broadcasting trials. And for a while, it was pretty sort of slow and mundane. But then you started getting these sort of celebrity cases. You had Ted Kennedy's nephew that got accused of rape. You had the Menendez brothers. Obviously, what really gave the boost to court TV was OJ. The OJ trial generated this sort of ESPN-like coverage where you'd have the actual trial, and as soon as it would end, it would cut to this panel full of lawyers that would all be arguing about, oh, Marcia Clark wasn't wearing a very good suit, and how's that going to affect the jury? And every little detail and nuance was analyzed. So it did. It had this sort of distinct look, this crawlers across the bottom of the screen, all these experts that would be there to sort of speak on any little single thing that happened at the trial. It was different from a lot of the other infotainment in the sense that you did have this live trial where you didn't have the heavy editing that you see that we talked about with police shows like Cops. Still, they're not going to just pick random trials to put on court TV. They're out there as news editors are trolling for the same sort of things: sex, drama, celebrities, particularly violent or gruesome murders. And the other thing, and I alluded to this already, was that they tend to, if you watch Nancy Grace, which we'll get to in a bit, they get wrapped up in sort of outside issues that aren't really legal issues. They're sort of beyond that. And I pointed this out in the blogs. It came up in the Philando Castile, and it came up in a couple other places, that part of the disjuncture between people who sort of see all the evidence and they're like, how could the jury do that? You need to recognize that juries don't hear and see everything they hear and see, and they hear and see some stuff we don't, that we're not privy to, at least initially. And so that also can create issues and problems. All right. True TV has become sort of the dumping ground for all of these sorts of shows. All right, so I covered a lot of this. There's been sort of a trial of the century every decade, if that makes sense. Um, so, uh, Surratt talks about cases that there's nothing new. So the Lizzie Borden axe murders happened, oh God, was in the 1800s, long, long time ago. The Lindbergh babies being kidnapped, on and on. Like there's literally a trial of the century every decade if you go back. What made OJ so great? God, you had a lot of stuff going on. He was black. He was an ex-athlete that killed his beautiful white wife and her white boyfriend. But it was done in a posh area amongst mansions. So you have the sort of wealthy folks behaving badly. Um, it's just bizarre how it played out. That he was trying to get away in this Bronco, and the police just sort of followed him, and it was all broadcast live. And you had this really crazy cast of characters. I suspect I'm going to watch it. I think later this summer. And a couple of you brought it up. The movie made off of this, but man, what a script! This sort of weird judge that went off on all these tangents. You had probably the handful of best defense attorneys in the whole country, the best DNA guy, the best testifier, Johnny Cochran in terms of being a really good trial attorney. And you had these sort of outgunned public defenders. Cato Caitlin was the pool boy who was supposed to testify, and then when he testified, sort of backed off everything. You had the racist police officer that lied about some of his testimony. So there was just so much going on that the news could cover, and people watched this. It lasted over a year, so people's whole lives, some of them got absorbed in this. There's reports of like people being addicted to OJ coverage. Um, the other one, just to give you a slightly more recent example, it was new when I started teaching this class, was the Duke lacrosse case, and it's probably old enough now that a lot of you don't even know what it is. What happened is some lacrosse players, I think they had a big frat party, and I can't remember if she was a stripper, came over and reported that she'd been raped, and these guys got arrested and charged with rape. And well, you can watch, so you can kind of watch the evolution of that. I put up a bunch of clips from Nancy Grace and from Jon Stewart. If you haven't seen Nancy Grace before, she's quite a gal. She's like a parody of bad media. So again, why that? Well, you have sort of rich white kids who got accused of raping black gal of more modest income, and from a media standpoint, what's not to like? So, all right. So one of the issues is whether and to what extent and how the media actually impacts public expectations about court, or how they see the court system. And so that's where that idea of the CSI effect comes in. And the CSI effect is essentially the belief of prosecutors that juries now expect, because of all this CSI and forensic stuff and police shows, they expect some kind of fiber matching or blood matching or blood spatter analysis. And a lot of this, even though it's sort of pseudoscience and not reliable, or is really general, they can say, well, it didn't come from this sort of carpet, or it did come from this kind of carpet. That juries come to expect it, and they are skeptical if, even with a bunch of testimony, if they don't have these forensics, that they might find the person not guilty. Does it really exist? Honestly, we don't have science on it. We don't, all we have is some sort of anecdotes from prosecutors who report that juries have become more skeptical and they believe this stuff should be there based on the media. Um, there is some evidence that the courts have responded to that. Even though we don't have a good science, that prosecutors are more likely to request sort of pseudo-scientific testimony. I don't know. I guess the more disturbing and sort of more scientific finding is that some researchers now are documenting what they call this punitive media echo. That juries who hear cases that are in any way similar to previous cases can kind of crack down on the new offenders. And so if, prior somebody got found not guilty of a certain offense and the public is sort of riled up about it, that it sort of has this whiplash effect on different future crimes. I guess it's a bit more disturbing that juries react to what has been done prior in the public. All right, man, I went through that. I'm gonna have to find some good quiz questions. Yeah, so now you know I'm going to make up the quiz right after this. Anyhow, so that's the courts. I hope folks sort of found, obviously on Moodle I went off on a different direction. It was more about, forensics and the CSI stuff and the bite mark stuff, which is interesting. So hopefully folks found that interesting reading to the extent you read it. All right, so corrections basically does everything after the court. So the job of corrections is carrying out the sentence of the court by and large. How much do we need to know about this? The nature of punishment has changed quite a bit over the time. In colonial America, punishments were all physical, corporal, or death. We handed out the death sentence for a lot of stuff because colonial Americans didn't have law enforcement. They could essentially catch people, whip them, flog them, kick them out of town. But if they kept coming back to town, they essentially just hung them. They put them on the gallows. And so it was not uncommon to have pickpockets hung. The punishment depended on who you were. So townspeople could get fined, whereas for the same offense, somebody who's not a townsperson would get whipped and banished and warned out of town. One of the first sort of big changes was the move towards reliance on prison, and that happens roughly at the start of the 1800s. For a variety of reasons, we kind of give up on corporal punishment. A big part of it was this idea of enlightenment. We tended to start to see human beings not as sort of cursed bastards, cursed for the original sin, but as like enlightened, rational human beings that we're all similar. And so in that sense, it got a lot more hard to whip and beat and mutilate and brand and lop ears off of people. And so the move towards prisons was less like, hey, prisons, and more of like, yeah, we're sick of pouring molten lead down people's shirt and tarring and feathering them and doing that other sort of stuff. And prison was sort of a way to avoid that. So we have these waves of prison building. Most of the prisons around here, Minnesota, our oldest ones like Stillwater and St. Cloud were the sort of second wave of prison building across the country. So you're talking mid to late 1800s. Throughout the 1900s, we sort of turned away from prison as punishment and towards the idea that we could use prisons to rehabilitate people. And that lasted for 60, 70, probably almost 100 years because it starts in the 1800s. That all changes in the 70s. And so, I've alluded to this before. We talked about it in the context of Dirty Harry, talked about it in terms of ideology, that the 60s was a very divisive, tumultuous time. And, conservatives were upset because society was changing fast. Everybody's becoming sort of permissive. People are having sex and smoking weed and doing all this stuff. Kids aren't wearing uniforms. Parents are being permissive with their kids. They're no longer spanking or whipping them. And crime's going up. And so conservatives are upset. They're upset about the civil rights movement. They're upset about the women's rights and prison rights. And so they tendencies to sort of lash out and demand law and order and respect for authority. Um, Liberals who value sort of equality and doing good and doing right and government helping people had seen the government sort of fail over and over again, and they'd seen the police fail over and over again in their response to civil rights in Vietnam. And so liberals would always been there to be like, no, we can't punish, we have to rehab. Essentially caved and gave in. And in conservative sort of beliefs about the effectiveness of punishment won the day. And what kind of took over from the 80s, I don't know, probably, well, still through today in some sense, is this idea that if you lock up enough people, crime will go down. And so, corrections today, if you go to prison, they sort of see themselves as managers, and they see their job as to kind of keep the inmates inside, keep them safe, keep them busy, and that's about it. Rehab has been rebranded as correctional treatment, and it's made a comeback, but a lot of that happens outside of prisons. It happens in the context of probation and other sorts of treatment programs. And there is, I should point out, there's a fair amount of evidence that it does work. Anybody interested, I do teach a class on correctional intervention where we talk about that ad nauseum. So here's the range of sanctions for our correction system. Probation is where you see a probation officer, but you get to stay in the community, and this is by far our most common sanction. I think about 60% or more of people sentenced get probation. We have some stuff kind of between probation and jail or prison. That law came out of the 80s. Jail is our short-term, less than a year sentenced, or people awaiting trial. Prison is our long-term sentence. People who go to prison can get subsequently supervised, a lot like probation, on parole or what's called post-release supervision. As with everything else, to the extent the media focuses on corrections at all, they tend to focus on this aspect down here, which is the least use, and nothing on most of this stuff. I don't know how much we need to talk about that. Well, I guess, when I talk about incapacitation, that's the idea that locking up enough offenders will reduce crime because there'll be less out in society to defend. So, I mean, it's fairly logical and fairly straightforward, right? If you just keep locking up high-rate offenders, sooner or later you're going to make a dent in crime. And the evidence would sort of confirm that somewhat. It tends to prevent some crimes, especially crimes that are high rate, right? If you think about how many burglaries or larcenies, this is just theft, or robberies you could pull off in a day. If I gave you a pistol and said, go rob a bunch of people, you could rob a lot of people in one day, and then think about how many that's over a week and a year. So it does have an impact. One of the best estimates is that in the 80s, when we doubled our prison population from 400,000 inmates to 800,000 inmates, we reduced robbery, larceny, and burglary by something like 16%. So, it can work. It's appealing because we know how to do it, right? You know how to build prisons, we know how to put people in. And so it has that appeal. Unfortunately, it doesn't work well, if at all, for the crimes we most care about, like rape and homicide. And if you think about it, right, how many people does the average murderer murder? One. And if they've murdered somebody and you put them in prison, you're probably not going to save any more murders. And so the sort of rare crimes are the ones that are most hard to prevent through incapacitation. The other thing is that for the economists and the business people out there, one of the big problems is the law of diminishing returns, that the more you do it, the less it works. Again, it's sort of straightforward economics that assuming we lock up the most hardcore people we can, every time we expand and build more prisons and lock more people up, that pool we're dipping into gets sort of more and more weak, less and less hardcore offenders. So the more you lock people up, every time you double the population, you're going to water down how well it works. There's also, cost. It costs billions of dollars. And so the old adage that if all you have is a hammer, every problem looks like a nail, One of the issues is if we take those billions of dollars and spend it on something else, could we get a bigger crime reduction? Um, so, um, talk about that. And this is the chart I showed you before. So, when you talk about the cost of incarceration, this is the rate per 100,000 inmates. So, for much of our history, the red line, I don't know why I got cut off, the red line is males and females. This is males, this is females, I think. Yeah. Um, so, for most of our history, we averaged about 100 inmates per 100,000. Now we've gotten up way up into the 6, 7, 800s, depending upon whether it's males or females, federal or state. Um, so a couple things noteworthy. One is sort of how far we've gone. It's not that we doubled incarceration, we doubled and doubled and doubled. The other thing is look at the timing, right? That this is the era right here of the sort of turmoil in society, the Dirty Harry. We're not going to watch it, but A Clockwork Orange. You guys voted for the other one. Um, and the point of using A Clockwork Orange was that we talk about this context right here and sort of the attack on rehabilitation and a turn towards more punitive policies. Um, so that's kind of the big, in terms of correction, in terms of our correctional system, that's the biggest part of the story is to recognize how much that prison population has grown and the fact that it wasn't sort of something that just happened in response to crime or something else. It was a policy decision that was made in the 80s to sort of get more severe, build more prisons, and lock more people up. How exactly, what were the mechanics? A lot of stuff we've talked about. For federal prisons and for some state prisons, a war on drug played a big part of it, that drug offenders made up, in the 70s, 5 to 10% of prison populations. By the 90s, they made up about 70% of federal prison populations, 20 to 40% of states, depending upon how sort of all in that state was in the drug war. We passed a bunch of get tough measures designed to increase sentence lengths. This is the sort of field of dreams theory of why we have high incarceration rates, that if you build it, they will come, that we build a lot of prisons. And so if you build a lot of prisons, you're gonna generally fill them up and have a lot of inmates. And so the key point is that this is all policy choice. This is decisions we made. It wasn't sort of a reflection or reaction to anything. It didn't have to happen. And so, all right, what are we going to talk about? I don't want to talk about any of this stuff. Let you off the hook. All right, let's get to the corrections and media stuff. So, in general, corrections is sort of the red-headed stepchild of the criminal justice system with respect to media. So, as Threat points out, the police get the glory, the courts get the public spectacle, and by and large, corrections gets the shaft. I also should point out that unlike corrections, probation and parole are even worse. That almost nothing in the media pays any attention to probation or parole. To the extent that corrections get covered, it's almost always jails or prisons. Threat points out, too, that corrections has a lot of times been its own worst enemy. So, every police department now has media lady or media guy that deals with the media, that's media savvy, that knows how to play the cards, that makes the police look good. Prisons have tried to duck and cover and shelter themselves and stonewall that. If a disturbance happens in prison, they hide it from the media. They don't have a PR person to talk to the media. They block access to inmates. And so they come off looking bad a lot of times, especially in the news. Part of the issue with all of this is that, a good number of us have contact with the police. A lot of us have gone to court for something or other. very few of us have gone to jail or prison. And so, to the extent you don't have any direct knowledge or knowledge from friends and family about something, you rely more on the media. And so this is one of those cases where people rely more on the media because they frankly don't have any other way to know what prisons and jails and probation are like. And so unfortunately, oftentimes debates about corrections can be based on sort of entertainment versions of what a prison is versus the reality of what a prison is. When you hear people talking about, oh yeah, inmates go to prison and the food's better than it is on the outside, and they have all this stuff and they get to go swim every day and play golf, and you're like, no, they don't. Um, all right. Through the areas where prisons have been covered, film, TV and infotainment, and news. Most popular historically has been prison flicks, corrections flicks, but when we say corrections, it's almost always prisons. So you think about what movies you can name off the top of my head: Shawshank Redemption, Green Mile, both of which, by the way, were from Stephen King books. Oh my God, why can't I think of prison films? Cool Hand Luke. For some reason, they're escaping my mind. Maybe you guys have done better if you're reeling them off in your head. One of the really unique things about prison films versus films on courts or films about police officers is that they focus on the bad guys. Most of the films focus on the inmates and not the wardens and corrections officers and criminal justice professionals. That ties into one of the major themes of prison films, and that is that prison wardens are corrupt, smug bastards, and the corrections officers are smug, hack, sort of brutal bastards that beat inmates. If you think of classic movie films, Cool Hand Luke, Escape from Alcatraz, Shawshank Redemption, corrections officers do not come off in a good light, and the inmates themselves are often portrayed as heroes. There are obviously sort of other, there's specific genres within prison films. There's prison action films, riot escape films, and so on and so forth. There's an irony in that. There's a sort of claim to authenticity in these prison films. And it's ironic because they're amongst the most inaccurate portrayals of anything in the criminal justice system. So, if all you had was, and you are old enough to have watched, I saw they're rebooting it, Oz. If you get HBO or access to HBO, Oz was a sort of, at the time, cutting-edge flick about a maximum security prison. But prison movies tend to portray violence as just like nonstop and people getting killed. And, people do get killed in prison. There is some violence in prison, but overall, especially in the last 50 years, that's declined dramatically. Prison inmates are more safe in prison. The homicide rate has dropped down below where the homicide rate is on the outside. So that's another one you can go into if you want. One of the things that's happened in the past 30 years is we've gotten pretty good at running prisons. That riots are down, escapes are down, assaults on officers are down, deaths of inmates are down. I don't know whether that's good or bad, but certainly different than what we see a lot of times on the media. So prison films have sort of dominated the landscape. Corrections was sort of the last component of criminal justice, right? You had Cops and American Detective and those things for police. You had Judge Judy and other stuff for courts and the media celebrity trials. Corrections, Surratt makes the argument that part of the reason it lagged is that the public was already told that film prisons were reality. And the other issue was that there's little incentive for corrections managers, wardens, to let people come in and film. That's changed in the last 10, 15 years. There's a bunch of reality shows, Lock Up, American Jails. If you ever watch MSNBC, Beyond Scared Straight. And part of it is that correctional managers, like police managers, have figured out that publicity can be good. That if you let in, these folks, you can come off looking like professional people, that you're competent people. And the other thing is prisons in general have become more open. It used to be that wardens sort of closed down the system, and now prisons are becoming more accessible. Why let lockup film in your prison? Because like cops, you get final say on what goes in there, and you can in part make yourself look good, make your prison look good. Who's in there? Wardens, corrections officers. I don't know why this slide is. Like police, correctional officers have tried to professionalize. Police have been more successful at it. We still tend to think of correctional officers that work in prison as sort of a low-brow, last resort job, and they tend to be hick people, frankly, because most prisons are out in the country, they're out in the middle of nowhere. So they have a bad media image. Police were able to resuscitate themselves. I'm not so sure corrections officers have yet. One of the other sort of stereotypes out there is that you see almost nothing in reality about female inmates. There's some interesting literature on how female prisons are different from male prisons, and there's different dynamics. Unfortunately, almost every female inmate film made is sort of B-grade porn. And if you watch Orange is the New Black, Black is the New Orange, whatever the hell it's called, my wife and I watched, I think, most of the first season, part of the second season. And it's funny, but if you've, like I have, sort of seen the whole media thing and understand the stereotypes, that whole thing is sort of based off really old bad stereotypes of what females are like in prison, and this sort of softcore porn image of female prisons. So I gave up on it, but I've heard it's good if you sort of follow through. In terms of, so we talked about entertainment, media, films, infotainment, and by the way, we're talking more about Scared Straight, Beyond Scared Straight. We have a specific topic just on that. In terms of media, as I said, corrections is the least covered. It's only in less than 20% of articles about crime and justice, and even there, it's mostly a bit role that somebody went to jail after recovering this trial, and they get sent to jail. And that's kind of it. If you probation coverage, they get roughly 0.1% of news coverage. And again, we recognize 60% of people that get sentenced to probation. So why more police court stuff? There's still a story to be told. Once somebody gets sentenced to prison, that's pretty much it. We don't cover them while they're in prison. Nothing much changes in terms of the court case. And so and it's easier to access, right? The media has contacts with police. They can get information. They have police reports. They have court reports. They can go to the courthouse. It's just easier to do. All right. So as I said before, the more remote the subject, the sort of less direct knowledge people have, the more backstage behavior there is, the more media shapes what people think and how people think. And the media portrayals of corrections tend to largely be negative. There's a study I used to assign when I hated students more about how the newspaper covered corrections, and the number one type of story was a violence or riot. Right? If you're media, that's sexy. That prison inmates took over part of a prison, or that there was a murder or something that happened. So violence, as it does other places, sort of rules in terms of how corrections is covered. Then there's that whole smug hack corrections thing. That if you watch movies, they come away with the sense that wardens and corrections officers are just bastards that take pleasure in beating down inmates. And the reality is nothing like that. I know a lot of corrections officers. I've gone on a lot of prison tours. I've talked to a lot of these people. Tend to mostly be good people. When we go tour the jail, the people tell you, like, look, you want to battle the inmates, you want to fight, they'll fight you. But they're here, they live here, man. Like, you can fight them, but the next day you're going to have to fight them again. You're going to fight somebody else. That what they really value from corrections officers is de-escalation skills and human communication skills. And that the good corrections officers are people that can persuade inmates to do what they want without using any force. Um, so we do surveys of people, we ask people, we do focus groups, and you get sort of two things. The one is that people believe that prisons are too soft on inmates and they get all these amenities that they don't actually get. Or they see prisons as these sort of horrible, violent places where somebody's murdered every day. And as I said, the irony is ironically, prisons, like everything else, it's homicide has gone way down. I wish I had a chart on this PowerPoint slide, but I think it was like our homicide rate in the U.S. is like 5 per 100,000. And at one time in prison, it was like 20, 25 per 100,000, but it's dropped down below 5. It's, like I said, it's safer to be inside a prison now than outside. All right. Covered a lot. I'm going to have to figure out what to put on the quiz. So thanks for bearing with it.